Pandemonium in the streets of Strasbourg. Is it part of a bigger threat? You bet it is. And oops, technology reveals secret Russian bases. And scammers get so darn creative in finding ways to steal things online. I'm Chuck Holton, and you're in the Hot Zone.
This is the Hot Zone. Engaging with the news in a whole new way, international war correspondent Chuck Holton brings insight into areas of crisis and lets you help those affected.
Hi, folks. Welcome to the Hot Zone. Christmas markets are a centuries-old tradition that take place this time of year across the continent of Europe. But there's a new tradition forming there, apparently, attacking those very Christmas markets. See, we don't have all the details about Tuesday's bloody shooting in Strasbourg, France, as I record this, but a look at other attacks on other markets in the region and even in Australia show a pattern developing that's really sort of worrying. And it's a symptom of the changing demographics of Europe brought on by massive waves of third world migration. Earlier this year, I was in Berlin, and while we were there, I visited the Kaiser Wilhelm Church, the site of another bloody terror attack back in 2016. On the 19th of December 2016, a Tunisian terrorist hijacked a semi-truck and drove it through a Christmas market that was on this spot, killing 12 people and injuring over 50. It was the worst terror attack in Germany since 1980. And he got away. They didn't actually find him until much later in Milan, where he was killed in a shootout. But this is a Tunisian man who came into Germany posing as a minor, as an asylum seeker, and then used the freedom that he had here to attack the very people that had given him asylum. Now, a new issue of a magazine called Dabiq, which is published by ISIS, just came out, and in it, ISIS called for just the kind of attacks we saw Tuesday when a gunman opened fire on peaceful shoppers in the city of Strasbourg, France. It turns out the perpetrator had 27 criminal convictions in France, Germany, and Switzerland. He was a known bad actor who was apparently radicalized in prison. As usual, the local news outlets are bending over backwards to keep from saying anything at all about radical Islam. But the likelihood of a mass casualty event being linked to radical Islam anywhere in the world is somewhere north of 90%. So I think we can be safe to say it probably was. In any case, ISIS supporters are rejoicing around the world as this latest attack on Christmas, and taken from this magazine that's been calling for attacks on Christian sites for some time. It's pretty clear that there are people reading this publication and taking it to heart. I talked about this in February when we were in Dresden, Germany. In August of last year, 14 people were murdered in Barcelona, Spain, in an ISIS-inspired terror attack, and we were there to cover that. One of the men arrested in that attack told investigators that ISIS is also planning other attacks across Europe, especially on churches and monuments like this one. This is the Frauenkirche in Dresden, Germany, and it was featured on the front page of ISIS recruiting magazine called Rumia a few months ago. They said that this is a perfect place to attack because it's where crusaders like to gather, and it's there just waiting to be burned down. And that's especially brutal because this church was just rebuilt in 2004 after being firebombed in World War II. So it just is another illustration of why it's so important for Europe to get a handle on this issue of mass migration and the extremist ideology of ISIS and the people that could use that flow of migrants to come into Europe and use it to cause harm. So this is definitely part of a larger trend, and it's not just an attack on tradition. It's an attack on Christianity that's as old as Islam. It bears noting that the most recent issue of Dabiq also called for sniper attacks in New York City this New Year's Eve. So we ought to pay attention. This is the reality of the world we live in. If you want to be safe, you first have to accept the reality of the situation where you are. These days, bollards and barriers and heightened security are becoming a fact of life for people all across the globe. But it's a mistake to think that you can leave your own safety in the hands of someone else. We all need to learn to be more aware and to take common sense measures to reduce our personal risk wherever we go. And politicians in France are attempting to soothe the fears of the French people by spouting all the usual bromides. For example, the president of the European Parliament, which is based there in Strasbourg, tweeted out that they would not be intimidated by this attack, even while the parliament was placed on lockdown. So, for all the assertions that Europeans will not change their culture or their way of life because of the constant threat of more attacks, in reality, they are changing their way of life. They're changing their behavior. But Europeans are getting fed up with all the platitudes, and now they're starting to vote for common sense immigration reform across the continent. You probably didn't hear about that there were 2 other Christmas market attacks planned by migrants linked to ISIS that were thwarted in the last week in Germany. It's kind of strange how much the media overlooks when it cuts against the liberal narrative. I should also point out that France has every common sense gun law already in place that the left would like to see in the U.S., and yet these attacks keep happening. The gunman in the Strasbourg attack had a grenade at his house, which, grenades are pretty much against the law for civilians to possess every place on the planet, but yet he had one. See, ideology is stronger than law. Now, don't get me wrong, we need laws, but we also need to be careful to avoid the mindset that the best way to make people safer is to make them more vulnerable. And that's just my opinion. All right, let's move on. You might have missed this report yesterday out of Russia. The Russian version of Google Maps made a pretty big blunder that exposed the sensitive and even secret military sites from Russia all around the world. Ironically, it happened because they were trying to hide those very sites by blurring them out, but in so doing, they showed where they are and what size they are and etc. Don't you hate when that happens? It kind of reminds me of the unofficial motto we had in the Rangers, if it ain't broke, fix it till it is. Look, this isn't the first time that technology like this has given away much more than it was intended to do. The Pentagon got into hot water earlier this year when it came out that Americans were compromising U.S. national security because they were wearing Fitbits. This story broke over the weekend that I think is very important for national security and that I think probably is hard to understand unless it's shown to you, and that's why I want to make this little video here. Look, if you have one of these Fitbit devices or any kind of fitness tracker, that sort of thing, the data from these devices very often gets uploaded to a website called Strava Labs, and they sort of consolidate all of that information. Now, they have tens of millions of users, and what they've done is they've put out a heat map of where those users go all around the country, all around the world. And so check this out. So this is the Strava Labs website, and as you can see from this map, places like Europe and the United States are just lit up like Christmas trees because there's so many people in those areas that have these fitness tracker devices. However, if you go to some place that most people wouldn't have one of those, you can safely assume that the only marks you're going to see from this Strava website are going to come from Westerners that happen to be in those countries. Now, I'm zooming in here on Somalia, on the Horn of Africa. And if we go down here to Mogadishu, someplace that I've visited several times, we can see here that there is marks showing the outline. This is the airfield. This is the airport in Mogadishu. And I've been there. I can tell you it's a secure area, and everybody knows it's there, so it's not surprising that if there were U.S. troops there or Westerners there, that they would be running the fences, running around that T-wall that secures that area in order to stay in shape. However, if we move around a little bit, what we start to see gets pretty disturbing because over here in this part of the city, we have here this circle, which is actually the soccer stadium that features very prominently in the Black Hawk Down scenario. And now that happens to be a secure base also that's owned by the African Union. And when U.S. troops are there, it's not surprising that they would go for a run and they would mark that area. However, Something else we can see here is that there's some people running along this beach. Now, I've flown over this beach in a helicopter, and it's a popular place for locals to go, but I promise you it's not a tourist destination. And so if you're Al-Shabaab or Al-Qaeda and you wanted to take out some American troops, and you could find out this kind of information, that there are people from time to time running up and down this beach, that could give you the information you need to do a hit on U.S. troops. The bottom line is that so many troops probably don't have any idea that they're being tracked like that. And what that means is this is a massive personal security and operational security fail for U.S. troops, and not just troops, but you're talking CIA operatives or anybody that might have reason to wear one of these fitness devices and travel around the world to some pretty bad places. See, I think this is a great example of how technology is progressing faster than our ability to manage it. We often don't have any idea how the next exciting advance will affect our lives and our security long term. So many of us live in kind of a bubble. I mean, you probably don't know many terrorists or scammers personally, so you have this normalcy bias that sort of convinces you that they don't really exist. But they're out there, and today's technology is giving them access to you in ways that we're only beginning to understand. Cybercrime is becoming a huge problem around the world. In 2017 alone, it's estimated that cybercrimes like ransomware and identity theft cost the global economy more than $600 billion, and that number keeps rising. But today I want to talk about a little-known type of cybercrime that's affected more than 1 million Americans, but you probably haven't heard much about it. They're called relationship or romance scams, and they're actually very common. They allow criminals in far-off countries, in places like Africa or the Philippines, to take advantage of the goodwill of hundreds of thousands of Americans every year. Now, here's how it works. The scammer uses stolen photos to create an online persona, and they use dating apps and social media and the like to make contact with hopeful single men or women through those means. Now, they might spend 6 months or more gaining the person's trust, but they learn as much as they can about them in that time, about their families, and especially about their finances. They often claim to be an international businessman or worse, a U.S. soldier stationed overseas. And once they've gained the trust of their mark, they claim to have some sort of crisis. Their passport got stolen, or they need money to close a big business deal. And then they go to their unsuspecting friend for help. Now, you'd think a person would have to be pretty gullible to send money to somebody they've never actually met. But these scammers are real pros at what they do, and they spin a story that will get their mark to be willing to help out just this once. But then the scammers continue asking for money. And if the victim gets suspicious, then they resort to blackmail or threats or anything else to get as much money from their mark as possible. Now, it's absolutely mind-boggling how much money people actually lose in scams like this. And here's where this story gets a little personal for me. Now, I hear from women on just about a monthly basis who have been scammed by bad guys using my photos, stolen from my Facebook page or somewhere else on the internet. But by the time women figure out who I am, it's usually too late. This week alone, I've received 3 such messages, and one of the women claims to have lost $3,500 to the scammers. Now, these are some of the fake profiles that scammers put up to use my photos. You can see they even use pictures of my daughter to appeal to the compassion of their victims. Now, as much as I'd like to throat punch the jackwagons using my photos, I'm not the victim here. Problem is, this kind of crime is really difficult to prosecute, since it usually covers about 3 different jurisdictions on maybe 3 different continents. But the victims are very real. I've talked with multiple women who have lost their entire savings through scams like this, and there's nothing they can do about it. The bottom line is this: if you're looking for love on the internet, keep in mind that by some estimates, there are more than 1.5 million fraudulent dating profiles out there at any given time. So never, ever send money to someone you haven't met face to face. Because while these scams might not be as scary as North Korea attacking the power grid, for the victims, they are absolutely devastating. You know, it's always been so hard for me to grasp personally that there are people out there who think nothing of stealing from or victimizing others. I just didn't grow up that way, and I'm sure neither did most of you. But if there's anything I've learned in my travels, it's that in the United States, our culture is based on the foundational principle of the golden rule. that you probably learned in Sunday school. Do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. That's America. It's based on that Judeo-Christian principle. But it's a mistake to think that the rest of the world works this way also. Even here in Central America, where most people are Christian or Catholic, this idea of treating others the way you'd like to be treated isn't necessarily as much a part of their culture. Instead, a lot of cultures around the world are just the opposite. Do unto others before they do unto you. Take from him before he takes from you. Don't put others first, but look out for number one. That's what you see in a lot of places. So when it comes to our personal security, both here at home and when we travel, we need to keep a clear understanding that there are bad people out there who would love nothing more than to do bad things to you and yours and to me and mine. That doesn't mean we live in fear. It just means we live prepared and aware to safeguard those we love. And it also gives us a responsibility to change the world one little interaction at a time as we love the people we meet and show them the great value of living a life based on love. So that's all for today's podcast. There was so much more I wanted to get to, but we'll have to save that stuff for another day. In the meantime, I hope you're taking some time to cherish the important things in life this Christmas season. So before I go, I just want to ask one more time, if you get a chance, would you check out our Patreon page? If you wouldn't mind buying me a cup of coffee every month to share this kind of information with you and your friends, we can do a lot better job of putting these things together. Also, please share and like this podcast, whether you're watching it on YouTube or Facebook or Podbean or iTunes or anything. It really helps us if we can get some rankings and some ratings in there to make the podcast better. So thanks for being with us. I'm Chuck Holton on The Hot Zone.
The Hot Zone is produced by Amy Holton and Livefire Media. Copyright 2019.